Hi everyone, my name's Jenny. I'm a PhD student here at Jesus and in the Geography department at Oxford. I'm a human geographer, or more specifically a cultural geographer. This means that my studies focus largely on how communities are inherently related to their local landscapes, as well as the non-human beings within that shared landscape. My discipline argues that there's a close reciprocal relationship between people and their environments. So the people impact the land and the land impacts the people. Today I'm going to introduce you to the topic of the politics of nature. So in this lecture we're going to be spending a lot of time trying to think through together what we understand about nature, but then also reflect upon why we might have particular ideas or assumptions about what nature is, where it is, and why and how it should be protected. After quite a philosophical first half where you will be engaging your critical thinking skills with some big questions about nature, we're then going to apply these skills by grounding the discussions in a case study. This case study is related to my own PhD research on nature and society in the Lake District National Park in northwest England. Finally, I'll present an optional assignment where you can demonstrate your own understandings of the politics of nature through a short report considering the benefits and costs of a Clwyddian National Park. So during this lecture, we're going to start with some more philosophical questions about what nature means and where we can find it. These questions help us to reflect critically on our assumptions about the separation between the human and non-human world. The session emphasises that there is a politics, so there are power relations at play which affect who makes decisions about what nature is, where it is, and how our environment is managed. These decisions are being made by people and organisations, for good or for bad, with particular agendas and biases which they may or may not realise are always affecting their decisions. So following our reflections on these 6 big questions, I'll start to ground some of this more philosophical and these political debates into a real-world example of the Lake District National Park in northwest England. The first big question I ask is, what is nature? I'm going to pause for a few moments, and it would just be great if you could note down some ideas or even some key words about what nature means to you. Okay, so in geography, we think it's useful to understand nature as a contested concept. There are many competing ideas about what nature is and why we need it. Each understanding has different impacts for how we see the world. Is nature the opposite of society? If so, what's the relationship between man and nature? Is nature then anything that's non-human? Is that animals? How wild is nature? Is it always wild or can it be tamed? So our rural space is nature, is the countryside nature, and what does this tell us about the relationship between people and the environment if there are parts of nature which are controlled or managed by people? Can we have natural spaces within man-made places? The space down at the bottom in the centre looks very rural, but that's actually a water park in central London. Down in the bottom right-hand corner there, is this nature on the building? This is a living wall on a street in Paris. So, what constitutes nature? What are the parts of the environment that we recognise as natural? Grass, green, animals. Is nature anything that's non-human, or can man-made objects and landscapes be part of nature too? Is nature always something that's already there and separate from humans that we can see and feel and visit but not be a part of, or can it also be something that we have made? So, similar to question one, I'm just going to pause here and ask that you think for a few moments about where nature is. There isn't any right or wrong answers. The aim is to get you to really think about if there are any certain places where nature exists, or if you can think of any spaces where you think nature doesn't exist at all. Okay, so where is nature? Well, depending on what we think nature is, we might be able to only find it in particular places which are specifically designated, or we might think it is something we can find closely and very easily, or even something which we can find inside us. These questions are really very closely related, and it's important for us to think about the implications of particular systems where nature is seen as something out there, non-human, wild, and generally separate from humans. So, how can we make sense of or conceptualize these contested understandings about nature? These diagrams aim to show how ecology and Western science more generally has tended to understand and define nature as something completely separate, or literally defined nature as the opposite of human society. We can call this a binary or a dualistic understanding of nature and society. This separation or distinction between nature and society emphasizes an assumption that nature is only found in specific non-human places. But how true is this distinction? We now know that through climate change, the human race is having a really significant impact on the world and even facilitating global warming. This human impact upon the geological entire Earth system processes has led to some scientists declaring that we have entered a new geological era called the Anthropocene, emphasizing the anthropological or human influence upon the world. If the human race can alter planetary scale processes, is there anything on Earth which can truly be considered as untouched by people anymore? So, the Anthropocene defines the Earth's most recent geologic time period as being human influenced or anthropogenic, based on overwhelming global evidence that atmospheric, geologic, hydrologic, biospheric, and other Earth system processes are now being altered by humans. These really quite difficult realizations lead us on to another big question. Why should we protect nature? I'll pause again here for a few moments, and it would be great if you could just note down some ideas or even some keywords about why we should protect nature. So once we have ideas and or knowledge about what nature is, and if we perceive nature to be in danger, many people feel really strongly that nature should be protected. But what is the purpose? What is the motivation for this protection? Is it for biodiversity? Are there particular moral or scientific arguments that compels us to look after nature? Do we want to prevent species extinction of both animal and plants? This is a complex mix of morality and science, where it may be that human behaviour has done something to really degrade particular populations of different animals, for example. For instance, these black rhino are vulnerable to extinction, which has sadly been caused by hunting and habitat loss. The reduction in their potential gene pool due to human interventions has made them very unlikely to develop evolutionary adaptations to survive significant environmental changes such as climate change. So these are some really complex questions that we can ask about the reasons for species protection. So that species have a home. Is it important that we keep a non-human space for animals where they can be safe and away from interference from people? Who usually decides which places should be made unavailable to people so that they are specifically there for animals? And what's the impact on the people that may live here and might have lived here in harmony with animals for a very long time? So that we all have a home. Is this another reason? Climate change is impacting obviously the very spaces where people live as well as animals and plant species. Is there any space which humans haven't actually impacted? Or are we protecting nature so that we can still enjoy nature? Is it really important for people to have space to visit, space to relax and enjoy? Visiting nature also creates a really important source of income for a lot of local economies and national parks and things like that. And it can also be understood as a really effective way to better understand different people and different places. Or is it a mix of all of these different ideas? Are there any other reasons that you can think of? The next big question I have is, how do people learn what nature is? Again, if you could just write down a few thoughts on this. How did you learn what nature is? How did you learn about particular natural places, or how to identify something as natural or unnatural? I'll pause here again for a few moments while you just note some ideas down. Okay, so how do we learn what nature is? Lots of people don't often have the chance to spend a lot of time in nature. A national survey in the UK in 2017 found that 12%, so about 1 in 8 18 to 24-year-olds, had never seen a cow in real life, but they would know what a cow was. How would they know this? We often don't come to understand what nature is from direct contact with nature, but through representations of it. This might be through popular media such as stories, films and television. Most of us learn at a very young age what the impact of stories have on us when we were young, really stays with us. So I'll go through a few of these different examples here that I've put on the screen. So here, A couple of hundred years ago, if we lived in a city, we might have seen or learned about nature through images and artworks such as paintings like this one here. Or it may have been that we had read poetry, such as the poems of William Wordsworth. Wordsworth describes his romantic poetry not only through what the natural landscape looks like, but what it feels like to be in them. In the top right-hand corner here, we can see an example of a building called a viewing station in the Lake District National Park. If a couple of hundred years ago we were very rich, we might have gone on holiday to visit one of these viewing stations, which framed the landscape through big windows so that you viewed it properly according to the men who constructed these sites. And they also used these coloured glass panels to help you think about how these landscapes looked through different seasons. We might think of these features today as very old predecessors to the Instagram filters that people now use to enhance their photographs. Some other examples might include children's books, which teach us about particularly compelling characters and places from a very young age, so that can be really influential on our understandings of the world. There are also magazines that we might read as adults for enjoyment, to learn more about particular places or activities in the world. There are compelling films such as this one here, which are set in nature and also highlight individual experiences of nature. So this abandoned bus in the image here is featured in the film Into the Wild, about a young American man called Chris McCandless, who ventured out to live on his own in the Alaskan wilderness. In more recent years, social media has also become a really effective way for people to learn about nature, not only from organisations and celebrities, but also from family and friends and other people who share their images, videos and other content across the internet. So there's a really important relationship between the means through which we come to know nature and how and why we want to protect it. But how do we actually go about protecting nature once we have learned where and what nature is? So again, if you could just take a couple of minutes to think through and note down perhaps some of the ways that people protect nature, that would be fab. Okay, so here I want to pause for a moment and think about some of the potential influences and interconnections between these approaches to nature protection, which I've somewhat simply gathered under the umbrellas of scientific and social methods to how we protect nature. So habitat management looks at the holistic system of interrelated organisms within a given natural environment and aims to maintain or usually improve the condition of that habitat, particularly if it's regarded to have been degraded by human interference. Habitats can vary in scale from ponds right through to national parks, entire landscapes which become protected by even national or even international regulations from particular kinds of activity which are thought to be harmful to the nature in these spaces. The designation of particular habitats as protected areas is often based on forms of scientific evidence, but these spaces are also really often celebrated for their connections to both natural and cultural heritage. There are therefore many really social and political dimensions to protected area designation, which vary from levels of protections afforded by different countries to the way the evidence was collected to support a particular designation's approval. So the organisations in charge of the designation might focus on particular things that they think are important rather than others. On a closer scale, so point 3, biodiversity through species-specific management is often achieved through targeted breeding, additional animal protections or rehabilitation through reserves. These are sometimes used to protect particularly vulnerable species. The exact methods of protection can sometimes be quite contentious, so to protect one species might mean the reduction in the population of another, or it might mean the removal of some healthy creatures from their own habitat to use them in breeding schemes to increase population numbers. So these different approaches also have really social dimensions, because the public might feel particularly strongly about the protection of some more charismatic, cuddly looking species over other maybe less cute but equally ecologically important other species. Finally, there are some social approaches such as education and communication, which are often used as means to bring awareness to the public about the ways we can do more to protect nature. School courses, government campaigns, and even social media platforms and video games have all been used by conservation organisations as ways to encourage the public to act more responsibly. These social campaigns often emphasise particular scientific facts as catchphrases or slogans to promote and emphasise their view on the story. So there are some really important blurring points that I want you to think about here between the social and scientific methods, which are not often made explicit. These social dimensions to nature management lead to my final big question. So who decides? Who decides how, where and when nature should be protected? Again, just take some time to jot down a few ideas about who you think are the most important and the most powerful, these might be two different things, decision makers in these important issues. Okay, so I'm sorry there's so much text on this slide, but I just wanted to give a flavour here of some of the many different actors who may want to have a say in decisions about nature. So who decides what nature we should protect? There's so many different actors involved here. Different countries, communities, organisations and private businesses all have different ideas about what nature is and how it should be protected. They all have different agendas and different ideas about what parts of our environment are most important and why. Who decides where we should protect nature? Similarly, these same stakeholders might want nature to be protected in different places. Some people and institutions want nature to be protected close by, where others think it might be something that should be prioritised overseas or in a place that's not inconvenient to them. Some people want to be really a part of the action and doing that all the time, doing their part to protect nature. Who decides how we should protect nature? So the different methods that we use to protect nature also have very political components. The intensity of these methods, how intrusive they might be, their scale and the intensity of the conservation methods upon the species involved can all produce different results and have varying impacts upon the different communities as well as the different environments that have a stake, that care about the given environment or species. So who should make these decisions? This is a really normative or subjective moral question. There are a lot of contested ideas about whether the decision about what, where and how nature is protected should be made by conservation experts, the local communities, impartial institutions, governments or the general public. And finally, who has the most influence in these decisions? So the groups who we might think should make these decisions are not necessarily the ones with the most influence. Some of the people who might be really influential in these roles might even be things like your religion might impact how you conceive or think about who should be able to decide what nature is and where it should be protected. It might be something written into your sort of faith. Then there are some really powerful international bodies like the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, so that's UNESCO. The IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, so these are the people who designate and categorize protected areas across the world. National governments, historically colonizers might have a really powerful impact upon the way that different countries that they've sort of colonized are being divided and separated into spaces for nature and nature reserves across different continents. Private landowners, corporations, civil society, so NGOs, charities might want to have a bit more influence in these decisions. There are some really effective international charities, grassroots movements, so movements starting from the people, activists who want to really have a say, groups like Extinction Rebellion, the general public. So there is also obviously a general public who wants to have some say in these decisions, but how influential are the general public really? And is that through democratic methods, through the way that they vote for particular governments, or is it through our support of particular charities, or is it using our purse? Is our economic influence the biggest sort of tool at the general public's disposal? There are also some celebrities who might want to be quite influential in decisions about nature protection. And then there are obviously the local communities who live in these areas and obviously know a great deal about the landscape that they live in, and their families might have been in for many, many generations or even hundreds of years. But often these groups are sort of thought of as lesser experts because they might not have the formal education of scientists, even though they do know a very great deal about their landscapes. So what is political about nature? So this diagram on the left I've shown you before. What do we learn from asking all of these other questions of ourselves and thinking more and thinking critically about what nature is, where it is, how it's managed, and who has a say in these decisions? A really key idea I'd like you to take away from this class and think about really carefully is that there's always a political dimension to the way we understand nature and society, especially if they're represented to us as these separate entities. This separation has some specific political consequences which are often felt most acutely, so most strongly, by the people who live in and around spaces which are considered as spaces for nature and identified as important by other people. In these diagrams, we can see that in general, the move to protect nature from humans relies on an understanding of nature and society as separate from one another. Relatedly, Western science is the most powerful mechanism through which nature is protected, so environmentalism. And for this power to hold, science must be seen as rational and objective and unimpacted by politics, and personal biases that the individuals conducting nature management might have. But nature and society and science and politics, they're fundamentally even intertwined. Even the most robust scientific research has involved human choices and biases. There are always political dimensions to knowledge production, even if this comes down to thinking about the particular methods that might need to be used on a given day or in a given time by a given person to do that assessment of the state or the particular habitat. So there's a real politics and a power to the ways in which knowledge about nature is produced and enacted. There's an unspoken but complex and close relationship between theory, so the ways that we produce knowledge and make sense of nature, and practice, so how we manage and engage with nature. Some people's knowledges, usually scientific theories, are assumed to be more important, where other people's knowledges, such as local or indigenous communities, are sometimes seen to be more subjective, contestable, and therefore easier to cast aside in decision-making processes about what we do with nature. So, in the final few slides here, I'm just going to look through some of these issues with you in a case study example of the Lake District National Park. So here we'll examine some of these big questions and think about who the powerful voices are in determining what nature is and how it's managed in the Lake District. So I'm going to go through these key questions that we've already been looking at in a more abstract sense. So what is natural about the Lake District? Where is nature in the Lake District? How is nature protected in the Lake District and by whom? How has the Lake District been understood by people as a natural place? And what are the consequences of particular understandings of Lake District nature being more powerful than others? So just in case you didn't know, there's a map here of the different national parks and AONBs in the United Kingdom. So the national parks are in yellow and the AONBs are in orange. And so this yellow blob here in the northwest of England, this is the Lake District National Park. So the Lake District National Park is England's largest and one of the oldest national parks in the UK, and it was formally established in 1951 and covers a huge area, over 236,000 hectares. So what's natural about the Lake District? Well, it's very well known around the UK and even across the world for its very mountainous terrain and also its really picturesque lakes, which together create these very dramatic landscapes. Where is nature in the Lake District National Park? So the Lake District National Park is dotted with lots of additional nature protected designations such as SSSIs, which we'll come on to talk about. But the entire Lake District National Park area was also awarded World Heritage status by UNESCO in 2017 as a cultural landscape. So this recognises bringing together its very interrelated natural and cultural qualities as a place of global uniqueness and significance. How is nature being protected in the Lake District and by whom? So there are some quite common examples here, especially on the left. So first of all, the UK government has sets of rules and regulations about the protection of nature, right from the national park designation itself. The UK's national park criteria are actually quite different from the international categories that have been decided. So there are many different types of protected areas across the world, and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, so the IUCN, has split these into 6 categories. So even though the IUCN call category 2, so the second most sort of strong protective category, they call their second one category 2 national parks, UK national parks are actually category 5, so quite a lot less intense sort of protection levels there, and category 5 is a protected area managed mainly for landscape or seascape protection and recreation, so enjoyment, leisure activities, as well as the protection of nature in these places. The Lake District National Park has also been designated a World Heritage Cultural Landscape, as I said, by UNESCO. And this worldwide organisation doesn't actually have any legal status of obligations in the UK, so they can't force people in the UK to do particular things to protect that landscape. However, if the site's not maintained to UNESCO's expectations, the site can lose its status, which has happened very recently to a cultural site in Liverpool. Moreover, there are a lot of important social, political and economic benefits tied to this status through important industries such as tourism and through the branding of products such as food, produce and drink which come from the area. Smaller parcels of land in the UK are sometimes protected through SSSIs, so these sites of special scientific interest are evident across many protected areas in the UK, and they're usually designated as small, rare habitats or places which contain particular rare species. These spaces do have a set of legal protections in place for their management, but they are also often still on private land, so they aren't accessible to the public. Regional organisations such as national park authorities or government bodies like Natural England might often have a role in designating and monitoring SSSIs. However, there are many other social groups working to conserve nature in the Lake District who are often less prominent and powerful. Fell farmers have a hugely significant role in the maintenance of the Lake District landscape, as was actually recognised by UNESCO in their World Heritage inscription. However, their role is hotly contested, as many nature conservation organisations would like to see the sheep flocks which graze these landscapes drastically reduced or even removed entirely. Other local businesses and short-term volunteer-led projects also do important small-scale work such as tree planting or path maintenance to keep the Lake District's most popular tourist destinations from being too degraded just by the sheer number of visitors who walk across the mountain paths each day. And I'm sure a lot of you can think of very similar examples in Wales where there's a lot of work being done to protect your amazing mountainous national parks as well. So here I'm just going to talk through a few examples of how the Lake District has been understood as a natural place. So we've talked about a few of these different sort of mediums before. So I earlier mentioned this viewing station as a way to really frame the landscape, and also the really beautiful and compelling photographs and paintings many years ago of landscapes which really portray a very dramatic, natural and sublime, picturesque scene. There's also people like Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, who's wrote really compelling poetry about the Lake District. And this romantic idea of nature emphasises not just what we see, but what we feel when we're in a space that's thought to be natural. The Lake District can also be understood as quite an adventurous place. So down here we see a map of the different Wainwright walks. So Alfred Wainwright was a famous writer who came and made these pictorial guides of the Lake District and sort of set very specific paths for people to go on their own adventures through the Lake District and see particular views and see the places that he thought were the most important, impressive, and compelling natural sites. So he set over 200, I think it's 214 different walks that you can do across mountains in the Lake District. There's also the idea of the Lake District as a rural idyll as well as an adventurous place. So we get a lot of romantic stories about the countryside and the happy sort of traditional way of living in countryside spaces from a lot of images, but also from children's stories right from a very early age. Things like Peter Rabbit which was written by Beatrix Potter, who was a shepherdess in the Lake District. All these compelling stories help us to think about nature in slightly different ways and from very different ages as well. And finally, there's this idea of the role of social media, and here we can see a really quite particular non-human view of the Lake District, where you can't really see from this photograph, which is on social media, the impact that humans have had on this landscape. It very particularly focuses on the topographical features of the landscape itself, the mountains and the lakes, these non-human elements of nature, even though the Lake District National Park Authority is here actually celebrating the World Heritage status, which is about both the natural and the cultural assets combined of the Lake District. So here I've just identified the mechanisms through which these different views or understandings of nature have come to be. So this was the paintings, the poetry, social media, photographs, stories, walking guides. These are the mechanisms through which these understandings were made. So there are also some really important hidden representations that we need to consider. So alongside some of the more dominant representations of nature, these representations have been contested by people who feel unseen. So this particular postcard here down at the bottom is a really effective example of art and photography by an artist called Ingrid Pollard, who wanted to really highlight that there is a very white-centric view of the Lake District National Park, and indeed a lot of English pastoral understandings of nature, which tends to ignore the much more multicultural identity of Britain today. And so she really sought to use art and photography to explicitly challenge particularly this idea that the Lake District is this very whitewashed Wordsworthian landscape. And this big poster she actually put up on a billboard on a London street to really bring the countryside and the urban together. So she's a really effective artist for helping us to challenge these ideas of where we find nature and what nature should look like and who should be encountering nature. And social media is another really important tool here. And the images represented here are from a Lake District shepherd called James Rebanks. So he's a fell farmer up in the Lake District. And here he's trying to show his view of the Lake District as a much more working landscape, full of everyday encounters with wildlife and livestock, and how important that is to him as part of the way he identifies his relationship with nature and how he encounters it on a daily basis. We can even see some sort of tree planting going on in these images. So here we've got some tree planting going on and some species identification here, but this sits alongside the fact that he's also got feeding his sheep and might also be reading different books and writing different books indeed, because James Rebanks is an author, giving his cattle forage there as well. So this is all really interrelated to the way that the landscape has produced food for his cattle, and then that cattle will go on to become part of our own food systems. But these views are not really what we think of when we're looking at those previous views of the Lake District that we've just seen. So what are the consequences of particular dominant understandings of the Lake District being more powerful than others? So the most powerful representations of nature and understandings of nature are romantic. So the most dominant understandings of nature are based on a really tourist-centric and romanticised understanding of nature as idyllic spaces of leisure rather than working landscapes managed by people and animals. These Lake District natures are also white-centric. So as Ingrid Pollard's work aimed to emphasise common understandings of rural idylls in the idyllic landscapes in England, are also based on white-dominated representations of nature and British landscapes, and also the way that that links to British identity and undercuts a lot of the multicultural benefits of, and histories of the UK. These natures are also non-human, so there are always some perspectives which are better heard than others. And as social scientists, we can work hard to help uncover some of the assumptions that are hidden beneath the surface of these different representations. So I'm just returning to this slide again to really emphasise that I hope we have been able to see from some of these more dominant and hidden representations that there's a real politics and power to the way in which this knowledge about nature is produced and enacted. And it's sometimes easy to see that scientific theories are presented as more common sense and compelling, but there are really important local stories which also need to be heard, even though they're often seen as more subjective and contestable. These people might have very long existing views about the landscape, or they may have very alternative views about our histories in our relationship to nature. and we should work hard not to cast aside those different perspectives in decision-making processes. So that's all I have to talk to you about today for now. I hope that's been an interesting discussion. But what I just wanted to do was present you with an optional task if you choose to take it on, to design your own research project to find out about people's opinions on a hypothetical proposal should the Clwyddian Range and Dee Valley become Wales' 4th national park. So there's some important things you might want to consider if you do choose to write just like a 1 page to 1.5 page report, just detailing some of the methods that you might use, what you would want, who you would want to include, and how you would present your findings if you were to work up a research proposal. If you do choose to come to university, this is the sort of thing that you might have to do if you're going to write a dissertation. You'll want to think about the question at hand. Are there any sort of sub-questions that you want to ask within this one? And who you want to include in your study. So who are the important stakeholders involved in the question? You might want to think about different scales of interest. So as well as the sort of more global and national implications of making a new national park in Wales, there are also some much more local and regional important considerations that you might want to consider. There are also different sectors who you might want to talk to, so conservation, farming, tourism, education. You also might want to consider the fact that this area is already an AONB, so it's already got a particular level of designated protection. What are the benefits or the costs of sort of upgrading this status, if you will, from an AONB to a national park, and what are the different implications about that? There might be some people who want to remove the AONB status. So how will you get to all of those different viewpoints? And what methods will you use? What will you do to find out what people think about this particular area and what their views are on its protected status? So different methods have different benefits. So with surveys and things like that, you could reach more people, but you're restricted usually to quite short answers or like tick boxes. But with interviews, you might be able to develop very rich, detailed discussions and find out really the root of why they have these particular views. But given time and constraints when we're doing these kinds of projects, you would only have the resources to do a few interviews. There's also lots of online tools. We've already looked at things like social media, or you might want to do really interesting walking interviews where you're sort of going through the landscape as well as talking to people. And then how would you present your findings if you were going to do this research project? Would you use a report? Would you use photographs? Would you make a website or a presentation? What are the different methods you might use to present your findings and the results of your project? You might think about with this who you want to listen to the results. Who is it that you want to target? Who are the people making decisions here that you might want to influence and let them know about these other people's particular views? And how might this type of project make a difference to the future of this place? So thanks so much for listening. I've come to the end of the slides that I have for you today. The assignment is obviously completely optional and just aims to get you thinking about how to do a project and think really critically about some of the conversations we've done today and how we've looked over today, and how you might uncover new knowledge and diverse opinions which represent a broad range of different stakeholders. So please do let your course director know if you would like to do this little mini assignment, because I'd be very happy to provide any feedback for you. And I really hope you enjoy the rest of your studies at Oxford. Thanks for listening.